Every great thing the British Empire ever built, it hung from a chain. The ships that carried its goods across the oceans rode at anchor on it. The pits that fed its furnaces hauled their coal on it. The ploughs that broke its fields dragged behind it. And in the worst years of that story, before the trade in human beings was finally abolished, the irons that bound people in the holds of slave ships were forged from it too. We remember the cotton mills of Manchester. We remember the steel of Sheffield, the shipyards of the Clyde. But the iron that held all of it together came from one small corner of the Midlands that almost nobody alive can name. It was a place where the sky was the colour of soot at noon and the colour of fire at midnight. Travellers who passed through it wrote that it was black by day and red by night. The smoke never lifted. The furnaces never cooled. Children worked the bellows before they were old enough to read, and women stood at the anvil for 14 hours a day, hammering red-hot iron in sheds behind their own kitchens, for wages that could not keep them fed. The people who saw how they lived gave them a name. They called them the White Slaves of England. The town is called Cradley Heath, and this is the story of how it came to make the chains of the entire world, of what that work did to the people who made it, and of the single autumn when the most exploited workers in Britain put down their hammers and refused to make another link. Cradley Heath sits about 8 miles west of Birmingham, on a low stretch of ground where the River Stour winds through the heart of the Midlands. The name is older than the smoke. Cradley comes from the Saxon and means something close to Crudder's clearing, a patch of open ground in the woods. For centuries the heath itself was just that, common land between the older villages, where families grazed a few animals and threw up rough cottages on the edges. Then men looked under the soil, and everything changed. Beneath that quiet heath lay one of the richest coal fields in Europe, a seam of coal 30 feet thick, lying close enough to the surface to be torn out almost by hand, and beside it iron ore, and the limestone needed to smelt it. The fuel, the metal, and the means to join them were all in the ground together. The town did not choose iron, iron chose the town, and in the early 1800s, on the banks of the Stour, a young man named Noah Hingley lit a forge that would one day reach all the way to the bottom of the Atlantic. Before there was chain, there were nails. For hundreds of years the people of this district had made nails by hand. Thousands of men and women bent over small hearths in their own backyards, turning out the iron pins that held together a building, a barrel, a ship. It was poor work, but it was the work the whole area lived on. Then, around 1830, the machine arrived. Factories could now stamp out nails by the ton, faster and cheaper than any human hand, and the trade that had fed the heath for generations began to die. The nailers did the only thing they could. They kept their hearths, kept their hammers, and turned to the one iron product the machines could not yet make. They turned to chain. Chain still had to be built link by link, each loop bent while red hot and hammered closed by a person at an anvil. And so the skill of the dying nail trade poured into a new one, and the new one grew at a speed that is hard to picture now. Noah Hingley founded his firm in 1838, and within a generation moved his great works a short way north to Netherton, raising furnaces and forges along the canal. A family called Rock built the largest chain works in Cradley itself, which later passed to a firm known as Jones and Lloyd. At Corngreaves, a vast ironworks poured iron decade after decade, but the soul of the place was never the big factory, it was the backyard. Most chain was made in tiny sheds attached to the workers' own homes, buildings that doubled as the family brewhouse, packed so close together that a whole yard of families might share a single line of hearths. There was no factory district here. The factory was the gap between the kitchen door and the privy. By the end of the 1800s, this one small district had done something no other place on earth could claim. 9 out of every 10 chain workshops in England and Wales stood within a few miles of Cradley Heath, in a cluster of 5 neighbouring towns. The world came here to buy its chain, the anchor cables of the merchant fleets, the hauling chains of the coal pits, the harness chains of the farms, the heavy iron that held empires together at sea. Almost all of it was forged in these few square miles of smoke. And in its darker decades, the iron of the Black Country had very likely gone into the collars and chains of the slave ships as well, a part of the story the district has never been able to fully prove and has never been able to fully escape. The greatest single thing it ever made left the works in the spring of 1911. At Hingleys, by then settled in Netherton, the men forged an anchor for a new ship being built in Belfast, a ship the world would soon know by a single word. The centre anchor weighed almost 16 tons, the largest anchor ever made by human hands. Its chain and fittings together came to something near 100 tons, more than 1,000 feet of cable, every link forged and tested by hand. When it was finished, it was loaded onto a great cart and dragged out of the works by a team of Shire horses, through streets lined with people who had come to watch it go. The ship was the Titanic. There is a piece of grim local humour, passed down ever since, that the anchor was the only part of that ship which ever truly did its job. But here is the truth the smoke hid. The same square mile that forged the largest anchor in the world also held women earning 4 or 5 shillings a week. The sky above it was the colour of slate at noon. The night was lit by the red glow of the furnaces thrown up onto the clouds. In the sheds, women stood at the anvil with their babies in boxes beside them, swinging a hand hammer or working a foot-powered hammer called an Oliver, 12 and 13 hours a day, turning out as many as 5,000 links in a single week. Small children worked the bellows. The heat was savage and the air was filthy, and in 1888, after an outbreak of typhoid in one of the worst of the yards, a government inspector wrote that he had found squalor and dirt far surpassing anything he had ever seen. People did not call these workers poor. They called them the white slaves of England. The system that kept their wages so low had a name. The women rarely dealt with the manufacturers at all. Between them stood a middleman called a fogger, who handed out the iron, collected the finished chain, and took a quarter of the money for himself before the worker saw a penny of it. Many of the women could not read the dockets they were asked to sign. They took what they were given because the only thing on the other side of refusing was nothing. For years the conscience of the country looked away. Then, slowly, it turned back. Investigators came to Cradley Heath and wrote down what they saw: the squalor of the yards, the children at the hearths, the women grown old before their time. The scandal of what people now called sweated labour reached Parliament, and in 1909 a Liberal government passed the Trade Boards Act, which set up boards with the power to fix a minimum wage in the most brutally exploited trades in Britain. Chain making was one of them. In the spring of 1910, the new board fixed a minimum rate for hand-hammered chain at 2.5 pence an hour. For many of the women, that one decision came close to doubling their pay. It should have ended there. It did not. The law allowed a gap of 6 months before the new rate had to be paid, and the employers saw their opening. They went to the women, many of whom could not read, and asked them to sign a paper agreeing to carry on at the old wage through those 6 months. Numbers of them signed, never understanding what they had given away. They had been handed a living wage by Parliament and then quietly cheated out of it by the very men they worked for. Into this came a woman named Mary MacArthur. She was not from the Black Country. She was a trade union organiser, the head of the National Federation of Women Workers, and she understood something the employers did not. She understood that the women of Cradley Heath, among the poorest and least powerful workers in the whole country, had the law on their side for the first time in their lives, and that if they held together, they could not be beaten. In the late summer of 1910, she came to the town, stood up in the schoolroom of a small Methodist chapel on Granger's Lane, and told the women not to sign and not to work until every last employer paid the wage the law had promised them. On the 22nd of August, they laid down their hammers. What followed was extraordinary. Hundreds of women came out, and then closer to 1,000. Women who had never once in their lives refused an order, women with no savings and children to feed. They walked out of the sheds and into a fight that the whole country was about to be watching, because something new had just been invented, the newsreel camera. That summer, the moving pictures caught the faces of the Cradley Heath women and the squalor of the places they worked, and carried them into cinemas across Britain and beyond. People who would never set foot in the Black Country saw for the first time what their chains had cost, and money began to come. A relief fund swelled to around £4,000, a small fortune in those days, enough to keep the strikers fed through the autumn. Among the gifts that arrived was a van loaded with bread and 2 hams, sent so that no striking family would go hungry before the fight was won. If the story of the places Britain built and then chose to forget means something to you, take a moment to subscribe so that towns like this one are not forgotten a second time. The employers held out through September, and one by one their resistance broke. A manufacturer who had formerly objected to his women being paid the higher rate found himself on the wrong side of his own workers and of the watching nation. For the better part of 10 weeks, the women stayed out through the cooling weeks of autumn, and firm after firm gave way and agreed to pay. By the end of October in 1910, the last of them had surrendered. The women had won. It was the first time in the history of the country that some of the most exploited workers in the land had stood together and forced a living wage out of their employers, and it became one of the foundation stones of an idea that seems obvious now, and was revolutionary then, that every worker, however poor, is owed a floor beneath their feet. They could have spent what was left of the fund on themselves. They had earned it many times over. Instead, they built a building. With the money that remained when the strike was over, the workers of Cradley Heath raised an institute on the lower High Street, a hall with a library and meeting rooms, and opened it in 1912. They called it the Stoot. For close to 100 years it stood at the centre of the town, the place where the victory went on living in brick, a reminder that ordinary people had once done a thing the powerful had sworn could never be done. And yet the triumph changed less than you might hope. The forges stayed in the backyards. The smoke stayed in the sky. The children still grew up in the heat and the noise. What changed was not the work, but the worth of it. A woman's labour now had a price below which it could not legally fall, and a woman who had once been told she was worth 4 shillings a week had learned, in the hardest way there is, that she was worth more, and that she could make the world admit it. What neither the women nor the men who fought them could see was that the trade they were fighting over was already dying. The blow had been struck years earlier, quietly, in a workshop not far away. Around 1903, a firm called Samuel Woodhouse and Sons, working at the Eagle Works, became the first in Britain to make chain by electric welding, joining each link with a machine instead of a hammer. A welded link was faster, cheaper and stronger, and it had no need of a woman at a hearth. The hand trade that had clothed the empire in iron had been handed its death sentence 7 years before its finest hour. The women of Cradley Heath had fought hardest for a craft that was already slipping away beneath their feet. For a while the old work held on. As late as the 1930s, there were still 68 chain works and chain shops in Cradley Heath alone, close to a third of all the chain making left in the entire country. But the direction was set, and it ran only one way. After the Second World War, the decline turned steep. The backyard forges fell silent through the 1950s. The great firm of Jones and Lloyd closed its gates around 1970, and out at Netherton, the works that Noah Hingley had built, the works that forged the anchor of the Titanic, held on until 1986, before it too went dark and was pulled down. There was a final wound, and it was a quiet one. Late in the century, a new road was driven through the town, a bypass to carry the traffic the old streets could never hold, and the junction at the heart of Cradley Heath was reshaped around it, and a supermarket rose where the trades had stood. The Stoot, the workers' own monument, lay in the path of the road, and so in 2006 it was taken down, brick by careful brick, and rebuilt 4 miles away inside a museum. The building that the poorest women in England had paid for with their courage could not, in the end, remain in the town they had built it for. Walk through Cradley Heath today and you would not know any of it. The air is clean. The sky that was once black at noon is an ordinary English grey. The smoke is gone. The furnaces are gone. The clank of 1,000 hammers is gone. There are shops and a market hall and the traffic on the bypass, and a town of around 25,000 people getting on with their lives, most of them with no particular reason to think about chain at all. The thing this place once did better than anywhere else on earth survives now only as memory, kept alive in a handful of places that exist precisely because the living trade did not. At the Black Country Living Museum, the Stoot stands again beside a canal, and a hearth is lit so that visitors can watch a single link of chain made by hand, the way it was made here 10,000 times a day for a century. A few miles off, at another open-air museum, an old chain shop fires its hearth a handful of days each year, the smoke rising again over the quiet for an afternoon before it dies away once more. And in Cradley Heath itself, where the women once walked out of their sheds and into history, there now stands a statue raised in 2012 by a local metalworker named Luke Perry, himself descended from chainmakers, of a woman at her anvil. Once a year the town gathers around her to remember what was done here. There is a kind of room you can still find behind the older terraces of this district, a small brick shed attached to the back of the house with a cold and empty hearth where an anvil used to stand. For 100 years, rooms like that one made the iron that held up the ships and the mines and the farms of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and broke the backs of the women who worked them. The fire is out now, the hammer is silent, and above the little shed where the smoke once turned the day into night, the sky is finally and uselessly blue.